mic doesn't work, apparently. We don't know how it works. Huh? So I have to speak up. My voice doesn't carry, but okay, bear with me. Sorry for all those who have to sit down on the floor. What am I doing? But it shows how interested you are in the topic. That's very good. The only things that are relevant in my background to talk today is the fact that one, I served in Syria. I was posted to Syria as head of UN office just before the Arab Spring. So that gave me a sense of the Syrian perspective on the Middle East and other issues. I think that's very important. I will refer to that to try to explain the behavior of the Syrian leadership in the current crisis. The second relevant fact is that I undertook this mission for the UN in November, just before I came here, at the head of a team of about 10 experts. It was a kind of fact-finding mission intended to assess the situation of the Syrian refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Turkey, to see what is the impact of the Syrian refugees on the local communities which hosted them, and what the United Nations can do to help mitigate that impact, help the local communities deal with the Syrian refugees. And I will explain what the outcome of that mission is and where we are today. Please.
One chair,
One right there.
Okay, so the talk will be organized as follows. First, I will give you some depressing statistics about the human and economic toll of the Syrian crisis. Then I will talk about what the UN is trying to do about it, what the UN can do about it, and what the reaction of the international community has been to the UN appeal to deal with the issue. I could stop there, I suppose, and ask if you have any questions, but I think it would be more interesting to dig a little deeper and put the Syrian crisis in the context of what's been happening in the Middle East. And it's inevitable that we talk about and think about the Arab Spring, how it started, what are its root causes, where it's going today, and what are the future prospects for any kind of solution in the region. I will end up focusing a little more on what you call here ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, which is really more accurate, and why all of a sudden ISIS has become a major obsession for the world community, the Western powers, some of the regional powers. What is the origin of ISIS? What does it represent? Etc. So I will end up with some speculation about possible scenarios for future solutions. Okay. Today is the 4th year of the conflict. It's a milestone of sorts. Unfortunately, the milestone is reflected by some depressing statistics. Over 220,000 deaths in Syria, over 4 million refugees, 7.6 million internally displaced Syrians. The population of Syria before the conflict was 22 million. So practically half of the population is either kicked out in the form of refugees or being displaced internally to escape the violence. Widespread destruction of cities, towns, and villages. 12 million people inside Syria that need humanitarian assistance today. And countless millions of children who are out of school, both inside Syria and in the refugee community. To give you an idea of the composition of that population, 74% are Sunni Muslims. It's important because the Sunni-Shiite conflict comes up constantly as a major issue. 13% include the various branch of Shiism, including the dynasty that's now in power, the Alawites. 30% Druze and 10% Christian. So clearly 74% Sunnis makes it the largest majority, but it is ruled by a minority, which creates a lot of problems for the leadership. The economic toll of the crisis, 200 billion it is estimated. Losses for the Syrian economy. Unemployment went from 10% before the crisis to 57% at least today. Life expectancy dropped from 79 to 55 years. 2/3 of the Syrians now live in extreme poverty, as defined by the UN, means a person living for $1 a day. 440,000 people are still today besieged in different parts of Syria with no access to help them by anybody. 5,000 schools destroyed, occupied, or targeted. So it's a major disaster. It's actually, when you think about it, as I will explain in a minute, when I talk about the impact on the neighboring countries, it is a major crisis today. It's a time bomb. It could destabilize a region which is already in turmoil, as you will see. The 4 million refugees that I went to look at, 1.5 million have gone to Lebanon. Population of Lebanon, the total population of Lebanon before the refugees arrived was 4.2 million. It means 1/3 of the Lebanese population is made up of Syrian refugees. If you can imagine 100 million people coming to the US within 2 or 3 years as refugees, you get a sense of the scale of the disaster in Lebanon. 1.2 million Syrian refugees in Jordan, that's 25% of the Jordanian population, another major disaster, another ticking bomb. 300,000 in Iraq, well, for what it means to Iraq, which is already a disaster area anyway. We did not go to Iraq because of the security situation. There are 750,000 in Turkey. Turkey did not ask for UN help, so we did not go there. And 200,000 in Egypt. Now, what does the United Nations do in this kind of? The UN tries very hard to help as best it can. In this case, the UN has made a number of appeals to the international donor community to help mitigating the crisis. The UN has various agencies that specialize in dealing with humanitarian issues. The World Food Programme provides food. UNICEF deals with children and women's health and nutrition. HCR deals with refugee issues. So they work together, pool their resources, and try to cope with the humanitarian aspect. In addition, a large number of NGOs are also working very hard to try to deal with the humanitarian issue. The UN also tries to provide development assistance. Beyond humanitarian, you have to provide for recovery, development, and a number of UN agencies do just that. The UN Development Programme, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Health Organization, etc. A dozen or so agencies that do that. So the UN, because the agencies only have very limited funds of their own, their funding generally depends on voluntary contribution by donor countries. So at any given moment, these agencies that I mentioned will not have enough funds to cope with any crisis. So when there are crises, the UN tries to mobilize the international community by preparing specific appeals geared to each crisis. In this case, the UN appeal based on the mission I mentioned was prepared. We prepared very detailed reports of the extent of the crisis, what the needs are in terms of basic services, water, electricity, sewage, unemployment. If you can imagine the impact of this massive flow of refugees, we tried to quantify that, prepare various project ideas that could be funded that would mitigate the impact of that crisis. So we estimated the needs at about $8.4 billion to deal with both the refugees and the internally displaced population in Syria. Okay, that was my map. The meeting of the donors took place, was convened in Berlin in December last year. At the Berlin conference, we were able to get, at least in terms of pledges, promises, about 2.4 billion. Obviously, that's not enough. That's 1/4 of what's needed. Another meeting of donors was convened just last month in Kuwait. So another 2.5 billion were mobilized, or at least were pledged. So we are halfway through to the needs that we estimated last November. One difficulty has been to convince countries, especially Western countries, to host as many Syrian refugees as possible, those who are asking for asylum. So out of the 4 million refugees, the UN asked the international community to take in about 130,000 only, that's 3% of the refugee population, over 2-year period. Over 2 years, 130,000. So far, here's the outcome. Germany is willing to take in 30,000, Canada 11,000. The US, I hesitate to tell you how many, because it's very strange, 1 to 2,000. And 1 to 2,000 will be vetted very carefully before they are allowed in. So out of 130,000 requests, so far the UN has counted about 60,000 that could be welcomed by different countries throughout the world, not just Western countries, every country that volunteered. So this is only a drop in the ocean, as you can imagine. So the idea of helping relieve the pressure by having the Syrian refugees being accepted in different countries is just not working. And as you can see in the news on a daily basis, the Syrians have also begun to join these death boats and take their lives at risk, and many of them perish on the way to Europe in their desperation. Now, how did we come to such a crisis? You all remember, it seems like a long time ago, 4 years ago, Mr. Mohammed Bouzizi, who set himself afire in Tunisia and became the symbol of many things that are wrong with the Arab world. It was in December 2010. That single act was a symbol of everything that went wrong with the Arab regimes. It was a symbol of desperation, of poverty, of exclusion, and of the utter failure of the Arab regimes to come to terms with the most basic needs of their people. Material needs, political needs, democratic needs. Nothing was working because up to then there was not a single Arab country that could be considered democratic in the Arab world. But that event triggered a series of protests that looked like a generalized revolution propagated all through the world, the Middle East. Just think about, I just looked quickly through the events, it was quite remarkable. After the December self-immolation, Algeria went first with violent demonstrations, 29 December, followed by Jordan, 14 January, Oman, 17 January, Egypt, 25th January, Syria, 26 January, Yemen, 27, Djibouti and Somalia, even Somalia, 28th January, Sudan, 30th January, Iraq, 12 February, Bahrain, 14 February, Libya, 17 February, Kuwait, 19 February, Morocco, 20th February, Mauritania, 25th, Lebanon, 27th, and finally Saudi Arabia, 11 March. So out of the 20-odd Arab countries, 16 have experienced demonstrations that seem to be going stronger by the day. Now in retrospect, we wonder what happened to all these demonstrations. Why did the revolution fail to achieve its objectives? So far, the outcome has been that the dictator of Tunisia, Ben Ali, fled to Saudi Arabia after 3 weeks of demonstrations. Mubarak resigned, President of Egypt, former President of Egypt, on the 11th February, also 3 weeks after the events of Tahrir Square. Gaddafi resisted, he thought he could ride it out, but in the end, after 7 or 8 months of bombardment by the Western powers, including NATO, they finally had him killed by the 20th of October. Salah of Yemen resisted also. It took another year before he was convinced to relinquish power. I think it will be interesting to speculate a little bit about, try to make sense of how these different regimes reacted or resisted to this movement that was considered to be a very important movement. It could have been a revolutionary movement. It it could have led to very deep reforms, but in the end it didn't. The one analysis that I find interesting is to divide them into groups of countries in order to understand how they reacted. I think Egypt and Tunisia are a case apart in that their political, economic, and social structure was such that there are a lot of people, a lot of groups in these societies that had an interest in maintaining the system. They had vested interest in maintaining the system the way it was. So they weren't prepared to go as far as a revolutionary change. So it was easier for them to get rid of their leaders and try to keep the system as much as possible unchanged. And I think in retrospect we can see that in both Tunisia and Egypt, the revolution was not really a revolution. It was fairly superficial. The powers to be remained in power. In Egypt they are returning to the old system of Mubarak. And in Tunisia the struggle is going on between the old system and the new revolutionaries. Then there are the other states, what one author called the bunker states, the states that are ruled by minority cliques, clans, that came to power generally through coup d'etat, remained in power through force, coercion, repression, did not represent anybody, did not have any democratic system. These countries like Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Algeria, Libya, and so on, reacted violently. The crackdown was quick. The repression was very violent because these systems had a problem of legitimacy. Any kind of dissent in these kinds of bunker states was considered a threat to the regime itself. And therefore, there was no tolerance for opposition, for dissent, for any kind of protest. And we can see, as I see about Syria, how Syria reacted, overreacted to the events at the beginning of the revolution there. The monarchies, different ballgame. The Jordan, Morocco, and possibly Kuwait, so-called reformist monarchies, they were also afraid, of course, because of their legitimacy issues. They reacted by providing for constitutional reforms. The monarchs in these countries were prepared to give up some of their powers to elected officials through democratic elections. And indeed, in both Morocco, Jordan, and Kuwait, new constitutions were prepared, new elections, and that seemed to have taken the wind out of the revolutionary appeal of the young people that were in the streets. So Morocco, Jordan, and Kuwait got out of it that way. The more conservative monarchies, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, Bahrain, etc., they used a combination of financial incentives. They had a lot of money, they had resources, so they tried to buy social peace by putting a lot of money into their societies, but they also used a lot of repression, as you well know. I think this is one way to try to interpret the outcome of the Arab upheaval in different countries. I will not go back to the causes. I think everybody agreed that the root causes of these conflicts have to do with the issues of governance, of legitimacy, of the failure of development, economic development, political development, inequality, social exclusion. Generally, just the total failure of development in these countries. I will not speculate about the regional repercussions for the moment, but I would like to talk a little bit about how did something like ISIL become such a prominent actor in the area? How did it come about? Initially, people are very surprised to see one of the many groups that were fighting the Assad regime all of a sudden become a major power, a major source of preoccupation, and even a threat, considered a threat by the region and by some of the Western powers. If you remember just last year, when President Obama talked about ISIS, he talked about it as some sort of a terrorist group that could be taken care of militarily. And this has been what was wrong with the approach of the West to the whole region when the turmoil started. Very often they considered it to be the result of terrorist activities that could be defeated through military means. So the strategic military approach was dominant, which I think was wrong. they never really tried to look at the deep roots of why something like ISIL becomes important. What is its ideology? What is the basis of its appeal, and why it keeps growing on a daily basis? It turns out that the Islamic State of Iraq, as it started, goes back to actually 2006. It was based in Iraq. I don't know if I can point. Do we have this? Anyway, imagine the 1/3 of Iraq towards Syria. I don't know if you can see it. On the left of Baghdad and up north. That whole part of Iraq was basically no man's land because the Baghdad government could no longer control the territory. So ISIS began its power base in that area, no man's land, with a power vacuum. It implanted itself there, first fighting the US invasion of Iraq, and then growing by appealing to fighters from all over the world. And the main appeal then was fighting the US invasion of Iraq. The US being perceived by ISIS and its supporters as the enemy of the Iraqis, of the Muslims in the area, and therefore there must be resistance to it. So Baghdad, Al-Anbar, what this doesn't mean anything to you. Just think of the 1/3 of Iraq was basically in their hands. On the Syrian side, once the Syrian conflict became entrenched, and ISIS started getting involved in that as well, they quickly realized that 1/3 of Syria on the Iraq, towards Iraq, was also becoming a no man's land because the Syrian government, the Damascus government, could no longer control it. So we had another vacuum, another power vacuum on the Syrian side, and between them, the border that's between Iraq and Syria is actually an artificial border created by the Western powers at the turn of the century, after World War I, when the Ottoman Empire was defeated. So ISIS took advantage of this situation and created a very interesting ideology. Religiously speaking, their leader al-Baghdadi claims to be the Caliph, the descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. You probably know, even without knowing too many details, that after the Prophet Muhammad died in the 7th century, there were a lot of disputes among different groups that claimed to be his successor. Eventually, the Shiites went one way, and the Sunnis among themselves were also divided into many groups. So the succession of Muhammad was never really settled to this day. So al-Baghdadi took advantage of this situation. This is known to all the Muslims throughout the world. Took advantage of this situation to claim that he is really the only real Caliph. And the Islam he was promoting was the original Islam that was left by Muhammad himself. This is a powerful appeal to devout Muslims who may not be very sophisticated in terms of their historical knowledge, but this kind of appeal would lead them to believe that their religious leaders could possibly be illegitimate. And he claimed, al-Baghdadi, that all the Arab leaders that claimed to represent Islam had a problem of legitimacy because nobody really appointed them, they appointed themselves, or they were designated by the colonial powers. So he denounced wholesale the leaders of Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, North Africa, and he called himself the commander of the faithful, Amir al-Mu'mineen. And this title is disputed between him and other leaders. For example, the King of Morocco also calls himself commander of the faithful. But in the case of Morocco, only Morocco and some West African countries actually recognize him as the commander of the faithful. But imagine the King of Saudi Arabia, where the holy places of Islam are located, he also obviously considers himself perhaps not the commander of the faithful, but at least the preserver, the protector of Islam. So when somebody like al-Baghdadi comes and claims he is in Islam, in Sunni Islam, there is no such thing as a Messiah. In Shiite Islam, there is prediction of some sort of Mahdi, a Messiah that would come and resurrect Islam, the original Islam. But in Sunni Islam, there is no such a thing. So Khalif is the only term that's acceptable to the Sunni Muslims. physical person who is a successor to the Prophet. So this is the religious appeal, and his brand of religion is based on Salafism, which is the fundamental meaning given to Islam. His ideology also had a very powerful political component. That the Arab regimes, the Arab leaders, the Arab countries, that were, the map of the Arab world that you see here was a totally artificial creation of the Western powers. In fact, at the turn of the century, after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, there was a secret agreement between France, Britain, and Russia to divide the Arab part of the Ottoman Empire among themselves, including Turkey. Russia was supposed to take Turkey, but after the Bolshevik Revolution, they denounced this agreement. It's called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. They denounced it and they gave up their part. But France and Britain continued to play this game, and they drew up the map that you see here. So al-Baghdadi is saying that this map is a colonial map. It has nothing to do with the reality of the Arab world. And his intention was to redraw the map. That's what we should think about. And the way events are moving now, in fact, he's doing just that. Because he has already created a state including 1/3 of Syria, 1/3 of Iraq, and it is estimated there are already about 8 million people living within these borders that nobody recognizes yet. This area happens to be the concentration of the Sunni population in that part of the Middle East. On the left of it, at the coastline of Syria, is basically the Alawite Shiite, those who are in power now. They might find themselves controlling only a strip of Syria along the Mediterranean Sea, with the Sunni part going from that strip all the way to Baghdad. This is the new state that in fact, de facto exists, because it is being run by al-Baghdadi and his team as a state. They have all the makings of the state. They have courts, they have law, they have administration, they have military, etc. So, the religious appeal of his ideology appeals to the devout Muslims, clearly. The political appeal, of course, attracts all those who are interested in changing the Arab world, in giving it more dignity, and in redoing the borders that were created by the Western powers. Now, this makes ISIS, or ISIL as you want to call it, his intention, what he tries to convince his followers is that he is going to throw out all the Arab regimes that were created by the Western powers, since the Arab regimes are illegitimate. He is going to recover all the resources that they have been squandering while Arab masses live in utter poverty. He's going to redistribute that wealth on the basis of Islamic law. In other words, his development strategy is to take all the wealth back, give it back to the people, and develop a new nation state on the basis of the Islamic and political ideologies that I'm trying to describe. That also has appeal for those who consider all those who consider the Arab regimes as being illegitimate. And when you think about it, most of them are illegitimate, because they were put on their thrones by the Western powers. Few of them can claim, or all of them try to claim some descendants of the Prophet. It's not always credible. My own king of Morocco claims to be descendant of the Prophet. So the Moroccans are proud that their legitimacy goes back 1,300 years. Whereas the Gulf states have only been there since the turn of the century. Question of how you interpret it. So legitimacy of the Arab regimes is an issue. That's why they got extremely nervous when the Arab Spring broke out. And that's why they use every means at their disposal to quench it, to repress it, to neutralize it. And they have reasons to be nervous. None of them have gotten to power through any kind of democratic process. Okay. So the legitimacy issue remains. This is one area where ISIS is very strong now. For the Western countries to treat ISIS and what it represents as simply a military question is a very big error. What is their alternative? How can they counter this ideology, both religiously and politically? How they counter it? Very difficult. The West would be hard put in providing an alternative ideology, because the West has been perceived, for better or for worse, by the Arab people, by the Muslim people, as being essentially hostile, antagonistic to Islam. And you can go back to World War II or after World War II, all the ways in which the West has been attacking Muslim countries or Muslim people throughout the world, starting with the Arab-Israeli conflict, the unconditional support of the Israelis, the refusal to treat the Palestinian rights as at least equal to those of the Israelis. Then the attacks on Afghanistan, on Iraq, on Libya, now on Yemen. Even Saudi Arabia now is using the American approach to deal with what is a very complex political issue. So, bombing, using military, counterinsurgency forces, etc., is simply a short-sighted and ineffective way of dealing with a problem which is deeply political, ideological, and has a lot of appeal not only among those young people who have no future and who are attracted for various reasons to go and fight there, but for the majority of the Muslim population who consider the West as being essentially hostile to the Muslim world. Think about it. When the Iranian Revolution broke out in '79, what was the Western reaction? It was immediately to try to defeat it, to neutralize it. So they used Iraq, Saddam Hussein, they armed him, sophisticated weapons, chemical weapons that he used against the Iranians. That war lasted almost 10 years. It was devastating, millions of victims. That didn't work. When that didn't work, the West turned to other means to try to defeat the Iranian Revolution. This is still going on, as you know. Muslims throughout the world, they don't make this distinction. When the Iranian Revolution took place in '79, it was a major change for the Muslims in world history. It was the first time since the fall of the Ottoman Empire that a Muslim state rose up and stood up to the West successfully. Even if they are Shia, they're a minority, they have all kinds of problems, but still, symbolically, it was a very important event. And of course, for the West, it was also a very important event for different reasons. It was considered hostile to be defeated. When that didn't succeed, they've been trying other means. Sunni countries that are considered hostile to the West have been treated just as badly by the West. So this perception by the Muslim world that the West is against them and will use any means to undermine Islam is a very dangerous perception. It must be corrected somehow. I don't know how it can be corrected. So to go back to ISIS, to deal with it effectively, obviously, the obvious thing to do is to think about its ideological appeal, its political appeal, its religious appeal. You might ask, well, who can do it? Well, it's not going to be the CIA, it's not going to be the French, it's not going to be the British. It has to be some group or some elements that have a deep understanding of how the region functions. And unfortunately, the West has not been able to do that. I think I will not go further on this unless you raise questions, and I can elaborate on specific parts. Now, going back to Syria, why did the Syrian regime resist and resist successfully? When I was working there before the Arab Spring, Assad, who came to power, Assad's son, Bashar al-Assad, in 2000, appeared to be intent on reforming the economic and political system in the sense of more openness. He surrounded himself with a number of reformers who genuinely believed that the system could be changed for the better. They used Turkey as their way to entertain relations with the West. Unfortunately, Syria was under strict embargo by the Western countries because Syria was considered a sponsor of terrorism. Nevertheless, when I got there, I found these people working very hard. I used the United Nations without hesitation to help them reform the banking system, to help them become members of the World Trade Organization, to bring investors from outside to invest in Syria, particularly the Syrian diaspora. And things seemed to be going well. Things were happening. That's why it was extremely surprising for the Syrian leadership, for the Syrian people for that matter, when the Arab Spring hit them. They thought they were immune because of the changes that they were going through, and more importantly, because the Syrians considered themselves the incarnation of Arab nationalism. It's the only country in the Arab world that refused to make a separate deal with Israel. It's the only country in the Arab world that opened its borders before the Arab Spring to all the Arabs that came. No questions asked, no visas. Once they arrive in Syria, they have full political and civil rights. Whatever political rights mean in that context. It's after all, it was repressive. But they were considered, they were given the same rights as the Syrian citizens. This is important. Syria replaced, in other words, the leadership role that was played first by Nasser, then by Saddam Hussein, then a little bit less effectively by Gaddafi, who also tried to play that role. So when all these leaders of the Arab nation, of Arab nationalism, disappeared from the scene, Syria remains the only one. Remember, Syria is still occupied, was occupied by Israel since '67. And when you go to the Golan Heights, which is only 45 minutes from Damascus, you can see Damascus from the Golan Heights. So for them, being occupied to that extent is something very difficult to accept. But they accepted it because they thought the only solution for the Arab-Israeli conflict is a comprehensive solution. So this kind of strong belief in their leadership role in the Arab world, in resisting domination of the West, in refusing to make any deal with Israel, they thought they were considered leaders of the Arab world by all the Arabs. So they thought they were immune from anything that could happen to the regime. So when the Arab Spring broke out and reached the borders of Syria, there was a genuine sense of shock, of disbelief, which is still expressed by Assad when you see him giving interviews. They still cannot believe, given their record as champions of the Arab world, that they would actually be subject to the Arab Spring. And the first demonstration in Syria, this is interesting, this is characteristic of these kinds of regimes. They were just some kids who wrote some graffiti in the town near the border with Jordan, political graffiti. But the repression was terrible. It was immediate, it was violent, and that led to more demonstrations and so on, as we know that. So now we have full-fledged civil war. Now, the UN has tried very hard to find a global solution. First, Kofi Annan was mobilized. We all know about Kofi Annan. He was probably one of the most experienced, most effective UN diplomats. He tried for a couple of years. He managed to get the various protagonists together in Geneva. It's now called Geneva I, 2012. There were some problems about who should be there, whether the Assad regime would be represented or not, etc. At the time, Assad was still on the defensive. Before he was receiving strong support by Iran, by Russia, by Hezbollah, he was willing to compromise. So Kofi Annan saw some glimmer of hope that as the conflict progressed and as Russian support became more evident, and the Iranian support and the Hezbollah support, Assad became more emboldened and less willing to compromise. I think when Kofi Annan saw that, he threw in the towel. He saw no compromise whatsoever as long as the Russians were behind him. He was replaced by Lakhdar Ibrahimi, former foreign minister of Algeria, also a very seasoned diplomat. And he's not a quitter. He decided to put all his energy into finding a compromise. He tried for another 2 years, until 2014, convened another meeting in Geneva, Geneva II. But by that time, Assad was determined not to compromise whatsoever. Because by then, the so-called moderate opposition was on the defensive, was being defeated by the Assad forces, and the Islamist group were becoming more and more important. And therefore, the situation became extremely complex for the UN. Geneva I was no longer possible as a basis for any kind of compromise. Geneva II didn't go any better, and Lakhdar Ibrahimi threw in the towel, especially that he started getting very impatient with the Syrians. started expressing his frustration both with the Security Council and with the media, and he was declared immediately to have lost his impartiality by the Syrians, so he had to leave. Now we have a new UN representative and another seasoned diplomat in Italy, Mr. Di Mistura. Probably don't hear much about him. He's much more low-key, much more careful about what he says, what he does. He's trying to use an incremental approach by first focusing on one area where there's a possibility of compromise, which is Aleppo, major city in Syria, occupied by the Syrians on one hand and the rebels on the other. He's trying to ensure that first there is some sort of ceasefire negotiation, how to deal with Aleppo as a city, who's going to manage it. And then if that works, we would expand the negotiation, but that's not going anywhere. He's still trying, but he's already expressed his frustration with what he considered to be, he hasn't said it publicly because he has to be very careful, the deception of the Syrian side, the official side. Because they tell him things and they do other things, for example, bombing civilians, etc. So that's where we are with regard to the UN. Unfortunately, I don't see any credible prospects for an international conference to solve the crisis. I think what is likely to happen, probably, is that ISIS will continue to increase in power, that the strategy of trying to defeat them militarily is simply not going to work. If you can imagine the territory that I'm talking about, which is huge, if you want to defeat that kind of group, you would need at least 100,000 troops on the ground. And you know what the attitude is of Western countries of putting troops on the ground. It's a no-no. And bombing them is not going to defeat them. They almost, last year, they almost reached Baghdad. Now there are elements of ISIS all the way in Libya. Even Boko Haram in Nigeria now claims or proclaims allegiance to ISIS. So ideologically and politically, if not militarily, they're expanding very rapidly. And they're a very serious source of concern. Despite the fact that all the actors in the area are against ISIS for different reasons, whether they are Russians or the Iranians or the Saudis, it appears that this coalition, no matter what kind of coalition you can imagine, is not able to get together and elaborate a common strategy how to deal with ISIS. So, I would not be surprised to see, perhaps not immediately, but to see the map changing. And that's not something to think about lightly. If there is any change in borders, which were inherited from the colonial period, whether it's in the Middle East or Africa, that will be a major source of upheaval. And it is in fact happening now between Baghdad and Damascus. There is now a new state being created. It's called the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant. It may gain another name. What's going on in Yemen is also very, very serious. The Saudis are right to be nervous about the Yemenis, but Yemen is a very hard nut to crack. Back, I don't know if you remember, but back in the 60s, when Nasser was in power, when he tried to spread Arab nationalist socialism in the Arab world, he also tried to control Yemen. He sent in something like 30,000 troops in the early 60s. And that was considered Egypt's Vietnam. It didn't go anywhere. After 6 or 7 years, it became clear that Yemen is not a country that you can conquer easily, even with foot on the ground. So Nasser, after the 6-day war, he was tired of the whole thing and he withdrew his troops. And Yemen went back to its very complicated, tribally based political system, which now the Saudis are trying to defeat from the air, which is very, to me, it's very surprising. The Saudis know the Yemenis very well. They've been dealing with them for ages. They should know better than to think that they can actually bomb them to submission in any way, shape. It's just not possible. You probably also know that the Arab countries have decided, this is not new, to create an inter-Arab military force that would be used to intervene in crises like this. putting soldiers to fight these kinds of battles. It's not the first time that the Arab countries thought of creating a common force. It's not going to be the last time. It has never worked. It's very difficult to put a common interstate Arab force. There are all kinds of problems with it, materially, logistically, politically, etc. That's where we are. So things are moving very fast. Nobody knows how to handle them. The Western strategy has been ambivalent, to say the least, and I don't blame them. It's very difficult to deal with issues like this from the Western perspective. So we are now in a deadlock kind of situation with no way out inside, at least in the Syrian crisis. I think I talked more than I should have. So I would like to see what reaction they have from you and to see if I can elaborate some more. Yes, ma'am.
I was curious about ISIS and where they get their financial support.
Okay.
To do all this.
The areas that are controlled by ISIS